Hi, everyone, and welcome to For the Love of Reading, a podcast sponsored by Highlights for Children. I'm Christine French Cully, your podcast host and editor-in-chief of Highlights. On this podcast, we talk to people who share our desire here at Highlights to nurture a love of reading in kids, because doing things to make kids hungry to read is to help kids become their best selves. Today, we're talking about historical fiction, which is a genre many kids misunderstand or overlook. But given the opportunity, kids can quickly get hooked on historical fiction. And that's great because this genre, well written, can teach us what we need to know about the past and also help us learn so much about ourselves. It's important that we introduce young readers to historical fiction. My guest today is a true subject matter expert. She has many books to her credit, but you might know her best for her work with the American Girl series. She wrote the stories of the beloved American Girl characters Felicity, Josefina, Kit, and Molly. I am delighted that Valerie Tripp has agreed to talk to us today about her approach to creating historical fiction young readers love, and also about how historical fiction, by inviting kids to imagine themselves in the lives of others, can teach kids about another time in an entertaining and an even joyful way sometimes, and at the same time, gently offers some important life lessons. Valerie Tripp, welcome.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Chris.
Let's begin by understanding a little about how you became a writer of historical fiction. Where or how did you fall in love with this genre?
Well, I fell in love with that as a child, reading historical fiction myself. And please don't tell my husband this because he's a professor of history. But the way I learned the most about history was by reading historical fiction because I would make an emotional connection to that character, no matter what period of time the character was living in, whether it was ancient Rome or the early settlers here, the pilgrims here in the United States, or Native Americans, or someone living in China in the 2nd century. And you make an emotional connection to that character. The character becomes your friend, so you care. It matters to you what is going on in history at the period of time that this character lives in. So I think that's where I initially fell in love with historical fiction. And the other reason I fell in love with it was that it allowed me to stretch my imagination so that I lived in another time and another place with other people. It wasn't only that I imagined the characters wearing different looking clothes, let's say, for example, or their houses look different, or their modes of communication or transportation were different. It was also, what was expected of them was different. And I loved that imaginative journey to think, okay, what if I fell asleep and I woke up and I lived at the time of, let's say Joe March and Megan, Amy, and Beth March? How would I function there? And what would be important to me? And what would I love and what would be difficult? So I think I fell in love with historical fiction reading it as a child because I loved both the history that I was learning and also that wonderful imaginative journey that historical fiction took me on.
I love that. I had the same experiences as a child. It's historical fiction is a way to not only learn about what life was like over a time and in a certain place, but I think it's an opportunity to be moved by it. An opportunity that you don't get learning history in some other ways, with deepest apologies to your husband, the history professor. Yeah, I just love that it really moves us in that way. So that informs your work. How do you go about writing historical fiction that captivates kids?
Well, I actually begin thinking about what my readers' lives are like right now. Right now. What's going on in their lives? What's happening with their families? What's happening with what they're learning to do at school? What are they learning about being, kind of a responsible member of all the communities that they're in, whether it's a sports team or a Girl Scout troop or a church group or a neighborhood. As their world expands, how are they defining themselves? So I start out by observing, and if I possibly can, talking to kids growing up today who are the age of the character that I'm going to write about. So it really begins with today. And then I like to think of the story that I write as a bridge or sort of like a ribbon of connection that begins with the child reading in the 21st century and sort of flows through time and connects that reader to the character I'm writing about who lived at a very different time. And sometimes the ribbon is made up of things that they have in common. I've loved doing research and finding out that children were just as mischievous 250 years ago as they are today, and just as curious and just as interested in things, and just as kind. So I love thinking of that ribbon of connection of things that they have in common, but then I also like to think of it as a way that sort of leads them to think about themselves in a different way. So my favorite part is doing the research about that period of time that the characters live in. And here's the key thing, Chris. I have to say to myself, what was the crucial social, economic, or political problem of the period of time that my character lives in? Let's take my character Felicity, who lived at the time of the American Revolution, just on the eve of the American Revolution. That was a time where the colonists, and I set the story in Virginia, wanted to be independent from the king. And so I had Felicity be a girl who wanted more independence in her life than a girl would have had in the 18th century. So her story is parallel to what the colonies were learning. And they both learn, that independence is self-governance. It's not self-indulgence. So when I hit upon that crucial issue, my newest character, Maryellen, lives in the 1950s. And I felt that the crucial issue there was conformity versus diversity. We're just after World War II. We have television in our living room, so we see the whole wide world. But one of the things that television is telling us is, here's what your house should look like. Here's what your clothes should look like. Here's what you should be buying. So it's this push me, pull you of conformity versus diversity. So I had that be Maryellen's issue as well. She's part of a big baby boomer family in the middle of a great big family. Who is she as an individual? How is she diverse? How is she different? And what are the ways that out of kindness and responsibility and lack of self-importance, she sometimes has to say, you know what, for the good of the group, this is what I'm going to do, for the peace in my family, or in order not to hurt someone's feelings, this is what I have to do now. That to me is maturity. So once I hit upon that crucial issue, then I know what my character's personality is going to be. So it starts with the girl living today, my reader living today, and then it's very much nourished and informed and inspired by all the research that I do. And then it's a wonderful kind of melding of those two things. Oh, and then of course a healthy dose of imagination and the fun and delight of creating a character, and her sisters and her brothers and her pets and her friends and what her school is like, just all stirred in there together.
Your passion is coming through. And I love that idea of a ribbon of connection. I think it's fascinating that you start writing history by thinking about the reader of today and how the events of the past are still relatable. Can you talk a little bit more about research? Because I think readers sometimes wonder about the accuracy of the historical fiction.
Well, I was always so proud and pleased that at American Girl, for every character, I had a board of advisors. And these were people like my husband who were historians and had studied the period I was going to write about, had made it their life work to study a period. Also at American Girl, they had a research department. So, Chris, if I needed to know, in the case of Kit, my character who lived at the time of the Depression, at one point I needed to know how much would it cost to have a man's shirt dry cleaned in 1934. And the research department could find me those answers. So, to tell you the truth, what I learned as I went along was the research and the truth were really my best inspirations. Again, to talk about Felicity. At one point, I wanted the apprentice who works for Felicity's father in his store to run off and become a soldier. And my advisor at Williamsburg said no, he would have signed an agreement. He would have said no, that he would fulfill this agreement. This led to a wonderful story where he runs away and he hides in the woods. And so, what appeared to be a brick wall for my idea turned out to be a wonderful new avenue that I hadn't imagined in the beginning. But the truth led me to a far richer story, really. So I was always very, very pleased that the advisors met with me when I was thinking up the characters and their stories and the arc of their 6 stories. And they read all of the stories afterwards. They would say, no, people didn't use the word crew cut. You know, in Samantha's time, you can't use the word crew cut. I loved that. So I think one of the reasons why readers like the American Girls book is that they know they can trust the authenticity, and the accuracy has been very, very carefully researched. And many people have checked to be sure we are not. When I talk to students, I say, now, why couldn't I say that Josefina's mom drove her to the mall and, they went and bought her a new iPhone? You want to be sure that you've got your historical facts right, and not only the facts about a period of time, but also the nuances. For example, during Josefina's time, I was so grateful to the advisors because they would say, Valerie, a child would not have spoken to an adult in that manner. That's the way children in the 21st century speak to their parents. But when Josefina lived in the 19th century in New Mexico, it would have been very improper for her to address a question like that to her father. So they taught me subtler truths about the period as well, all of which enrich the story. Also, I believe, all of which are ways various readers then identify with my characters, because take Josefina, for example. She's shy and quiet and proper and polite, and so are many of my readers. And then take, Molly, who's always got an opinion on everything, and always has a plan for everything. And so do many of my readers. So I love the way the historical period supports and nourishes and shapes the character and the personality of my character, because that leads to variety for my readers as well, to say, I'm sort of like Kit in that I'd like to be a reporter too. Or I'm sort of like Felicity in that sometimes I'm a little impulsive and make mistakes. So that the historical period also, I think, is an avenue into the stories for my readers.
But characters that are not only identifiable, but that are also inspirational or aspirational are a huge part of what makes good books good, particularly historical fiction. We want kids to be able to relate to the characters, but it's really terrific when they see a character and they can see something in that character, a quality or a trait that they'd like to have in themselves, and they can aspire to that. I think you do that so well in your books.
Well, sometimes people ask me, which character are you most like? And sometimes they assume that it's Kit because Kit is a writer. And that was a wonderful thing writing about Kit, was it allowed me to talk about what a wonderful way of being in the world it is to be a writer. But the actual answer to that question is, I'm like a mother with many daughters and I love them all equally. And the other part of that answer is that I love trying out those different personalities. I would love to be brave like Felicity, but I'm not really. And I would love to be noble and thoughtful like Samantha, or I wish I were more noble and thoughtful like Samantha. So when you write about characters whose personalities are different from your own, it's a way to have a vicarious experience of what it would be like to to have that personality.
When you write about those characters and when you read about those characters. Yeah. Yeah. So it's important for kids to be aware that history isn't always pretty. And it can be uncomfortable to learn some of the stories of our past. How can parents use historical fiction to open up important conversations with their kids?
Well, that's a wonderful question. And one of my main goals from the very beginning was to spark conversations among the generations in a family. To, for example, Kit's story is very informed by the stories my mother told about growing up during the Depression. And I wanted that same experience for my readers, for them to say, as they were reading one of the stories, stop, wait, wait. Why are Felicity and her best friend Elizabeth having a fight? I don't understand. Why are they considered enemies now? What happened? And so the parent can say, well, they disagreed. Their parents disagreed about whether the king should still rule the colonies or not. And I'm always hoping that my reader will then reflect and think, oh, well, there are some ways that my friends and I don't agree as well. So I'm hoping that the problems that my characters face will lead to conversations. And I'm also hoping so much that even when we're writing about famous people, we see everyone's flawed. Everyone makes mistakes. Children certainly know they make mistakes. I, I could talk to you for a long time about the mistakes that I made as a child. I was just remembering today, merrily jumping on my parents' bed. Oh, just jumping, 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 and then breaking it. That was a mistake. And children know they make mistakes. And so I think it's wonderful for them to read about characters who make mistakes, famous people who make mistakes, and see it really matters what you do after. What do you do after the mistake? Do you say, I'm so sorry? Or do you say, okay, I've learned and I won't do that again? That's what really matters, because all of us are going to make mistakes. You can't help it. Nobody is perfect. And all the famous men and women who ever lived did things that they regretted. And so I think it's wonderful for a child. That's another way to empathize. Oh gosh, in the Josefina story, her aunt tells her, okay, don't touch this jar because it's very old and very precious. And Josefina thinks she's doing her aunt a favor, and she takes it off the shelf, and of course she breaks it. And then she runs away because she's so sad and sorry about what she did. And it's her other aunt who talks to her and says, well, you have to go and ask for forgiveness. Isn't that lovely to know forgiveness is part of life? Healing is part of life. People get sick and they get better. Things get broken and they get healed. People make mistakes and they atone for them. So I think it's, again, a great richness to say, even some of the people we respect the most made mistakes. If you could speak to them now, they probably did some things that they wish they had not done. And we have to look at the larger picture, and we have to look at their intent, and we have to forgive. We have to forgive them just the way we forgive ourselves.
That's true. That's true. The voices of the past can teach us so much. And in my experience as a reader, a lifelong reader who's read a lot of historical fiction, some of the best stories feature the voices not heard before, or the voices from the less familiar parts of history. I'm thinking of the stories of women and the stories of people of color. Unearthing some of these stories and holding them up to the light so that we can see their truths is really important work.
And I think it's important also. I always chose not particularly to write about famous people. I never gave any of my characters magic powers or superpowers, because I very much wanted my reader to say, well, she's a lot like me, and I'm a lot like her. And what would I do in her situation? And if she were here today, what would the two of us do together? It was very important to me that my characters weren't brilliant and they didn't have super talents. They were really true, authentic, hardworking, well-meaning children, and who grew and changed. They start out with certain expectations. Certain things change drastically for them in the course of the story. Because one of the things I wanted to say to children was, don't worry, it's going to be okay. You don't end up where you started out, but where you end up is all right. As long as you work hard, as long as you're honest, as long as you trust the people around you who have your best interest at heart, it's going to be all right. Don't you often wish, Chris, that you could speak to your past self and say, don't worry? Like, for example, right now, with everything that's going on with the pandemic, I know in the future we're going to look back and wish we could say to ourselves, don't worry, it turns out all right.
Absolutely. And I think books are a great way to give kids hope, to help keep kids feeling hopeful.
Yes. And joyful too, and full of delight, full of delight and just the fun of reading and laughing and getting a kick out of things and seeing. One of the things I loved about my research, as I said earlier, was I think it was Felicity. I was doing some research about a family that lived in Williamsburg when Felicity did. This is, 1774. And the mother called the girls in from playing because some guests had arrived, and the girls climbed up a tree and hid in the tree. They didn't want to come in. They didn't want to stop playing. And this is more than 250 years ago. So I love how some things haven't changed for children and then other things have. So I want children to be delighted by these characters. And then I also want them to sit back and say, wonderful as they are, Felicity and Josefina and Kid and Molly and Maryellen are fictional characters. So the choices I make are actually even more important because I'm a real person. So every decision I make about how I'm going to speak to people or how I'm going to treat the environment or how hard I'm going to work, all of those choices I make are shaping the world all of us are going to live in forever, more than these fictional characters. I really hope the readers realize their own importance. And that's why I write with such respect for my readers, because they're my partners in the story and because they're going to take all of this and move it forward in time. And I have to trust that they're going to do it with conviction.
Yes. I mean, we want kids to believe that they can be change makers, that they can grow up to be people with deep empathy who can really make the world a better place. And reading historical fiction can help instill that idea in children.
Yes. And also, it's a phrase that I read that you wrote, that childhood is a sweet, short season.
Short, sweet
And
season. We talk about that a lot.
it should be full of joy. I just think of the metaphor of how physically active children are and the joy that they have in moving around. And sometimes it makes me sorry that we're asking them to sit still as much as we do. We should let them be exuberant. William Blake says exuberance is beauty, and we should let them be exuberant and loud and curious and observant and try things out and not be afraid of failure as well.
That's right. That's right. Well, they can do some of that vicariously through your characters, that's for sure. We love the research that shows that people who read a lot of fiction for pleasure tend to be people who are more empathetic. It's easier for those fiction readers to do some perspective swapping and walk a mile in the other person's shoes. And your books certainly make that possible for
I
kids.
can't really think of any more important life skill than the delight in, the interest in, and then how shall I say this? Allowing yourself to dwell imaginatively in someone else's life. Whether it's someone you see in the grocery store today or someone you read about who lived a long time ago and is, fighting her way home through a blizzard, that ability to imagine another life not only gives you empathy and sympathy and compassion for other people, it also does a very important thing in that it gives you empathy, sympathy, and compassion for yourself. Imagination is a form of hope. So that if you're in a spot where you're not particularly happy sometimes, or you're feeling like maybe I should have done more homework than I did or something, you can have empathy and compassion for yourself as well, and hope that tomorrow will be better. Tomorrow will be better.
Oh, Valerie, you just beautifully articulated why we want kids to learn to love historical fiction, because it allows us to dwell imaginatively in another person's life. That was so beautiful, I had to repeat it. And when we do that, we gain empathy, sympathy, and compassion for others and for ourselves. That's why we want kids to learn to love to read, and particularly learn to love to read fiction and historical fiction. That was beautiful. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh,
If
thank
you'd
you.
like to learn more about Valerie, we will include her bio in our show notes here. And I urge all our listeners to find a good piece of historical fiction and immerse yourself in it today. Thank you, Valerie.
Thank you, Chris. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. For show notes and information about other episodes in our podcast series, visit us at loveofreading.highlights.com.
I love to go to the library because if I'm reading a history book, I can find more information from another book and maybe even make connections.
Hey parents, find more great videos on Highlights for Grown-ups, the channel that helps you help your kids be their best selves.